The latest developments in the Middle East have once again put global markets on high alert as the fragile ceasefire with Iran shows clear signs of strain today. As we predicted in our last report, President Trump announced the indefinite extension of the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire by 3 weeks following White House envoy meetings. But right after that announcement, he delivered a powerful hardline order directing the U.S. Navy to shoot and kill any boats laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz. This decisive command is in direct break. These actions follow the recent U.S. Navy interception of 2 Iranian oil supertankers attempting to break through the American blockade of Iran's ports this week. Iran's top negotiator has stepped back from the negotiating table amid reports of additional mines being placed in the strait, signaling rising internal regime turmoil. The exiled Iranian crown prince was also attacked with red liquid in Berlin, while calling for greater European support against the current Iranian regime during his visit. President Trump stressed that the United States holds total control over the Strait of Hormuz and will not rush any deal until Iran meets all key demands. He made it clear that the pressure. Meanwhile, 3 U.S. aircraft carriers are now positioned in the region, marking a significant show of naval force not seen since the Iraq invasion era. This escalation comes as the U.S. has redirected dozens of vessels and seized multiple Iranian-linked ships in recent days to enforce the blockade. The combination of these events illustrates why the post-Liberation Day calm we discussed previously has now given way to renewed geopolitical tension and uncertainty. Oil prices have responded sharply, with Brent crude spiking above $100 a barrel on the news of the mine deployments and naval actions. The strategic significance of the Strait of Hormuz cannot be overstated, as it carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply through this narrow choke point. Asia is particularly vulnerable, with major economies like South Korea and Japan relying heavily on oil shipments passing through the contested area every single day. These developments raise serious questions about the deeper motivations behind President Trump's tough stance, given the domestic political divisions within his core supporter base. While the core MAGA supporters prefer to avoid further military engagements, some key groups that backed his election are pushing for stronger action against Iran. The question remains how President Trump will ultimately balance these competing pressures as he decides the future course of American policy in the volatile region. Such political uncertainty is already causing significant ripples in financial markets, with investors closely watching for any signs of broader conflict or diplomatic resolution. This explosive news event perfectly sets the stage for understanding the latest investment research report from beyond the headlines that we have analyzed in depth for you today. In the report, experts connect these exact dots between the Hormuz tensions, the Federal Reserve outlook, and major shifts in big tech employment numbers. Stay with us as we dive deeper into how this breaking story intersects with those critical market forecasts and what it means for your investments moving forward. Because what this sudden escalation truly exposes is the complete fragility of that so-called ceasefire President Trump announced extending indefinitely just hours earlier in the Oval Office. And right after that, the president issued his shoot-to-kill order for any boat laying mines, which directly matches the report's description of the strait stress. This is exactly the adverse global supply shock Citi highlighted, with Asia taking the worst hit as 60% of South Korea's oil flows through that very choke point. Oil prices spiking to $98 for WTI and Brent over $100 confirm the report's warning that the post-calm is definitively over for markets. Meanwhile, the dramatic helicopter boarding of another Iranian-linked oil vessel underscores the blockade's enforcement, which the research team says is shutting in massive daily volumes. Citi now sees Brent running at $75 to $80 in the second half, or $120 in the adverse scenario modeled seriously after these events. Global growth has been cut to 2.7% and inflation marked up to 3.3%, with the biggest downgrades hitting Asia hard as predicted. But here is the rank hypocrisy that should outrage every single investor watching these dangerous developments unfold in real time across global markets right now. Trump extends the ceasefire with one hand while ordering shoot-to-kill operations with the other, exposing how fragile this peace really is, according to the transcript. Iran denies any infighting, yet their top negotiator steps back and the parliament speaker resigns, citing hardliner meddling as the report noted internal regime instability.
And do not forget the exiled crown prince splattered with red liquid in Berlin while demanding more support against the regime, highlighting ongoing opposition pressures. This geopolitical theater is forcing big tech to slash headcount, with Microsoft offering voluntary retirement to 7% of US employees and Meta terminating 10%.
The report calls this the AI CAPEX bill, hitting the operating expense line as hyperscalers protect margins by cutting replaceable jobs amid rising energy costs from oil. Jobless claims ticked up to 214,000, signaling the layoff side of the labor market equation may finally be moving, as Citi economists flagged. Meanwhile, the Fed chair fight rages on, with Senator Tillis blocking Kevin Warsh over the Powell investigation, creating institutional ambiguity during this active oil shock. Citi raised rate forecasts for 14 central banks, including 2 ECB hikes, while the Fed is still expected to cut later this year, revealing policy diverse. What a joke that politicians preach peace and negotiation while naval armadas assemble and oil infrastructure risks exploding, as Trump himself admitted in the interview. Voters in the polls show 80% desperately want to avoid prolonged conflict, yet support for the operation grows, exposing the deep divisions in public opinion. And the firing of the Navy secretary. The S&P dropped over 1% on the headlines before recovering, while the dollar firmed and Treasury yields pushed higher on the risk premium. Europe faces stagflation risk. The dots are connecting faster than anyone anticipated, which is why we must examine the forward look and broader consequences in the next part of this analysis. The forward look in the Beyond the Headlines report feels truly prophetic right now, because every single story this week depends entirely on what unfolds between Washington and Tehran soon. Will the Iranians provide any genuine negotiation signals in the coming days, or will additional mines appear, forcing Brent crude well above $110, exactly as warned? Overnight, Japan will release its important March CPI figures, which could compel the Bank of Japan to sharply raise its inflation forecast and reconsider rate hike chances dramatically. Tomorrow morning, UK retail sales data, along with the German IFO survey, will test whether the European stagflation narrative that Citi now warns about is materializing in hard numbers. Should the adverse scenario that Citi now models seriously come to pass, global growth would collapse toward 1.5%, with inflation surging close to 5%. Even in a best case where the Strait reopens tomorrow, several million barrels per day of damaged refining and pipeline capacity could remain offline for a full year or longer. Big tech companies continue their brutal bloodletting as the massive AI capital expenditure bill finally crashes into operating expenses, forcing Microsoft, Meta, and others to slash thousands of jobs. Jobless claims have already ticked higher to 214,000, rising precisely as the research team flagged, which signals the layoff wave investors need to prepare for immediately. The bitter fight over the next Fed chair creates dangerous institutional ambiguity at the very top of the central bank during this explosive active oil shock period right now. While the ECB prepares to hike rates twice this year, the Fed still plans to look through the shock, setting up a sharp and meaningful policy divergence across continents. President Trump finds himself walking an incredibly difficult tightrope as he tries to balance his MAGA base demanding peace with powerful interests pushing for much tougher action on Iran. American voters say they desperately want to avoid any prolonged conflict, yet the naval buildup and shoot-to-kill orders expose the profound cynicism of these endless Middle East commitments. Financial markets are suddenly being forced to price in something far more difficult than the recent calm, with the S&P 500 dropping sharply on these headlines today. The U.S. dollar firms across major pairs, Treasury yields push higher, and the software at risk basket collapses as investors wake up to this harsh new combined reality. Asia endures the heaviest growth downgrades from the oil shock, while India emerges as the standout nation least damaged, proving once again that impacts are far from uniform worldwide. The adverse scenario outlined by Citi is no longer some remote hypothetical, but is rapidly turning into the central base case if tensions in the Strait of Hormuz persist much longer. Any investor who chose to ignore the early clear warnings about oil prices, inflation pressures, and shifting central bank policies is about to receive a very costly and painful lesson indeed. Even the mighty Magnificent Seven technology giants cannot hide indefinitely from exploding energy costs, crushing margin pressure, and the urgent need for deep headcount reductions across Silicon Valley. But many viewed as a triumphant victory lap following Liberation Day has transformed overnight into a brutal reminder that geopolitics still dictates the direction of markets more powerfully than anything else. The post-calm period has officially ended, the connecting dots are now crystal clear, and the true price of fragile ceasefires is being measured in triple-digit oil and falling equities.
Get ready for a period of intense, sustained market volatility that will challenge and test every single portfolio because the Strait, the Fed, and these tech layoffs all scream the same urgent warning. This is the critical moment when all the paper stay extremely vigilant, my friends, because the beyond the headlines analysis has now become the single most important story every serious investor absolutely must confront and act upon live tonight.